Hey everyone, you know how much you all love learning about how our food system works, right? Well, today we're taking a deep dive into some stuff that will really get you thinking, I promise. We've got these articles, two of them actually, by Dan Blackburn. He's a journalist, and he's been digging into the modern food industry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and let me tell you, it gets kind of crazy.
Crazy how. What's he found?
He calls it, get this, the farm-to-pharma pipeline.
The farm to pharma pipeline.
Yeah, basically he's making the case that the way we're producing food now, well, it might be like setting us up for health problems.
Yeah.
And then we end up needing medication.
Okay, I'm listening. So it's like not so much about which foods are good or bad, but more about the whole system itself.
Exactly. Like Blackburn really digs into how the government, regulations, economic stuff, incentives, they all play a role.
Mm.
He even talks about the FDA and how they approve certain food additives. And these additives, well, they might actually be linked to health problems down the road.
Wow. That's a pretty big statement to make. Is he saying there's something like deliberately bad happening?
He doesn't use the word like evil or anything, but he definitely points out that there could be conflicts of interest.
Oh, I see.
Like what if maybe the same companies that are pushing the FDA to approve these additives? Well, what if they're also the ones making the drugs to treat the problems those additives might cause?
Hmm. I see where he's going with this farm to pharma idea. It's more about the money, not just the food, huh? Isn't that a little bit of a conspiracy theory, though?
He doesn't call it a conspiracy, more like an analysis of how the whole thing is set up, you
Yeah.
know? And to show what he means, he talks about how the FDA makes it really hard for natural alternatives to get approved.
Really?
Yeah, even if they might have some health benefits.
Huh?
Makes you wonder who's really winning in this situation, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. That really makes you think about, like, who's actually in charge here in the food world, and what are they most interested in?
Exactly. And it's not even just the FDA. Blackburn also talks about industrial farming
Mm.
and how it's basically changed how we see food altogether.
Oh, how
So
yes.
it's not even really seen as nourishment anymore. It's more like some kind of commodity, something to be bought and sold,
Mm.
a way to make a profit.
Wow, that's a huge shift. And I can see how that would change the quality of the food we eat. If companies are focused on profits, nutrition might not be the top priority anymore.
Exactly. And you know what? He says this whole commodity thing has made certain grains super dominant, like soy, wheat, and corn.
Huh.
Not because they're the healthiest, but because they're so easy to grow and process, and they last forever on the shelf.
It's amazing how something as basic as food can get so complicated? So I guess that's the farm side of things. What about the pharma part?
Well, Blackburn's argument is that all these cheap processed foods, they're often loaded with those iffy additives. And he says that might be a big reason why we're seeing more chronic diseases.
Ah, and then we need pharmaceuticals to manage those conditions.
Right, it's a cycle. And there are certain companies that seem to be making money every step of the way.
I can see why you said this was going to get crazy. It really makes you think about the big picture, not just the food itself.
Right. And here's where things get even more interesting.
Oh.
How so?
Well, Blackburn isn't all doom and gloom. He talks about solutions too. And to look at those solutions, we're going to hear from someone else, Joel Salatin. Ever heard of him?
Oh, yeah, the lunatic farmer. He's got this whole regenerative agriculture thing going, right? It's like the opposite of the industrial model that Blackburn's talking about.
Exactly. Okay, so Blackburn's saying this industrial agriculture with its huge fields of just one crop and all those chemicals, that might be part of the problem.
Just to be clear for our listeners, when you say huge fields of just one crop, that's called monoculture farming, right?
Yep, that's it. And Blackburn's point is doing that can really hurt the soil, makes it weak, easy for pests to take over, and then you need even more chemicals to fight them off.
It's like this downward spiral. So where does Salatin fit in? He's all about working with nature, not trying to control it. His whole approach is totally different from these giant farms with just one crop. He's got a mix of animals and plants all working together.
It's like a little ecosystem he's created. How does that work?
So instead of keeping his cows stuck in those big feedlots, he moves them around to different pastures.
Okay.
And these pastures aren't just grass. They've got all kinds of stuff growing. Grasses, legumes, herbs, even trees. It's like a buffet for the cows.
A cow buffet. I love that. That must make for healthier animals, right? They're getting more variety.
Exactly. And that's not all. Moving them around is actually key to keeping the soil healthy.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. In nature, you've got herds of animals moving around. They graze a bit, then move on. That way, they don't eat everything in one spot and give the plants time to grow back.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's what Salatin does on his farm. moves the cows every single day, so the land has time to recover. Totally different from those industrial farms where the animals are packed together, and it causes all those environmental problems.
Yeah, with the waste and everything.
Exactly. And here's the cool part. All that manure from the cows actually helps fertilize the soil. Because they're always moving, the manure gets spread out evenly, no huge piles of waste. It's like nature's own composting system.
So he doesn't need to use any artificial fertilizers then?
Nope. He's all about using what nature gives him. He even brings chickens into the mix. After the cows have been in a pasture, the chickens come in.
Oh, really? What do the chickens do?
Well, they love to scratch around in that cow manure. They eat the fly larvae, spread the manure around even more. It's natural pest control and helps break down that manure so it goes back into the soil.
Wow, that's amazing. Everything has a purpose.
Exactly. And it's not just about efficiency. It's about creating a healthy environment. He says his pastures are full of life, earthworms, good insects, all kinds of little creatures that make the soil healthy.
It's like he's not just growing food, he's actually helping the land too.
Right. And this is where it all connects back to that farm to pharma idea from Blackburn. Salatin's showing that you can grow food in a way that's good for the planet and good for people.
It's like breaking free from that cycle of needing chemicals and medicine that Blackburn's talking about. But come on, let's be real. Isn't this type of farming like a small thing? Can it really feed everyone?
That's a really great question, and there's no easy answer. But Salatin says it can be scaled up. It just needs a different way of thinking.
A different way of thinking.
Yeah, we've got to move away from this idea of squeezing as much food out of the land as possible, no matter what. We got to start thinking long term, sustainable.
So instead of trying to get every last bit of food out of the soil right now, we need to focus on making sure the land is healthy so it can keep giving us food in the future.
Exactly. And Salatin believes that in the long run, this regenerative way can actually be more productive. He says his soil just keeps getting better and better, which means he doesn't have to add as much stuff to it over time.
That's a really good point. So if his methods are so great, why isn't everyone doing it?
There are some challenges, for sure. For one thing, it takes a lot more knowledge and skill than the regular way of farming. You
Yeah.
can't just throw chemicals at every problem. You have to understand how the whole ecosystem works and work with it.
So it's not like following a recipe.
Exactly. More like conducting an orchestra than baking a cake.
Yeah.
And for farmers who've always done things a certain way, it can be kind of scary to switch.
I bet. It's a whole different way of looking at things.
And then there's the whole infrastructure thing. The way we get our food now, it's all built around those huge industrial farms with their processing plants and all that. Changing to a more local, regenerative way would mean a lot of changes.
So we'd need to support those smaller local farms instead of the big companies.
Exactly. And find new ways to get that food to people, ways that are affordable.
Sounds like a huge task, but really important.
It is. And I think Blackburn would say it's absolutely necessary if we want to get out of this whole farm-to-pharma mess he's talking about.
This kind of reminds me of another thing Blackburn talks about. He mentions this idea of a war on meat.
Oh.
What does he think about that?
He's pretty skeptical about how meat gets demonized. He points out that people have been eating meat for a long time. And he wonders if all this pushing for plant-based alternatives is really about health or if something else is going on.
Like what?
Well, he suggests that some of the biggest voices saying we should go plant-based, they're connected to the companies that make those alternatives. He's not saying plant-based is bad, but he wants us to think about the motives behind it all.
That's a good point. It's important to question everything, especially when there's a lot of money involved.
Exactly. I think that's what makes Salatin's approach so cool. He's not anti-meat or trying to tell people what to eat. He just wants to produce good food in a way that's natural.
It's a more balanced view, It's not just good food versus bad food.
Right. It's about understanding that everyone's different, and we all have to make our own choices about what we eat.
That's true. So where does this leave us? If we're worried about this farm-to-pharma problem, what can we do about it?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? But thankfully, Blackburn and Salatin have some ideas, some real things we can do to start changing things.
Okay, tell me. What do they suggest?
The most important thing they both say is being smart about what we buy, like making informed choices as consumers.
You mean voting with our dollars?
Exactly. We need to be more aware of where our food comes from and who we're supporting when we buy it.
But isn't that, just a tiny thing? Can one person's choices really make a difference?
I used to think that way too, but Blackburn says that when enough people start demanding certain things, companies have to listen. Like, consumer demand is a powerful force.
That makes sense. But a lot of people don't know much about all of this, do they?
That's where education comes in. Blackburn says we need to push the food industry to be more transparent. We need to know what's in our food, how it's made, what it does to the environment, the whole picture.
So we need to read labels, do our research, ask questions.
Exactly. Don't just believe what the ads tell us. We got to be smart shoppers.
It's empowering to know that we actually have some control over how our food system works?
Right. And it's not just about our individual choices. Blackburn also wants us to get involved in making bigger changes, like supporting laws that help create a healthier, more sustainable food system.
Like laws that support regenerative agriculture.
Exactly. Or laws that put stricter limits on those harmful food additives.
I get it. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Make smart choices as shoppers, educate ourselves and others, and fight for change on a larger scale.
Right. And you don't have to be perfect or do everything at once. Just take small steps in the right direction and things will start to change.
I love that. It feels hopeful and doable.
Exactly. Oh, and speaking of doing something concrete, there's one thing that both Blackburn and Salatin say is really important: supporting local farms.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Buy local and all that. But what difference does it really make?
Well, for one thing, the food doesn't have to travel as far, so that's less pollution. Plus, the food is fresher, healthier, but it goes even deeper than that.
Oh,
When you buy from a local farmer, you're not just buying food, you're helping your community. You're supporting a small business, creating jobs, keeping farmland from disappearing. Everyone wins.
I see why both Blackburn and Salatin are so passionate about local food systems. It's not just about the food itself, it's about making communities stronger and more sustainable.
Exactly. And it can be a really cool experience, too. Going to a farmer's market, meeting the people who grow your food, learning about what they do. It's a whole different way to think about where your food comes from.
I bet. It's a lot different than just grabbing stuff off the shelves at the grocery store.
Right. It brings back that human connection that's often missing in our food system.
So we've talked about the problems with industrial agriculture, the potential of regenerative practices, and how important it is to make informed choices as consumers. But there's one big thing we haven't really talked about yet: cost.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Is all this healthy, ethically sourced food way more expensive?
That's what people think, right? Eating well is only for rich people.
And to be honest, sometimes it is more expensive. But Salatin makes an interesting point. He says we often focus on the price tag without thinking about the hidden costs.
Hidden costs? What do you mean?
Well, when you buy those cheap processed foods, you might be saving money now, but later on, you could end up paying for it in doctor's bills.
Because that kind of food can lead to health problems.
Exactly. And those healthcare costs add up, not just for you, but for everyone.
True. And we can't forget about the environmental costs of industrial agriculture. All that pollution, soil erosion, water usage. Someone has to pay for that too.
Right. So Salin's saying that when you add up all those hidden costs, the difference between industrial food and regenerative food isn't as big as we think.
I see. We have to look at the whole picture, not just the price on the sticker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are ways to make healthy food more affordable, even if you're on a budget. Buying in bulk, cooking at home, growing some of your own food, even if it's just a few herbs on your windowsill.
It's about getting creative and making healthy eating a priority, whatever your situation is.
Right. And remember, you don't have to change everything overnight. Every little step you take makes a difference.
That's really encouraging. So we've covered a lot today. What are your final thoughts about this whole farm to pharma idea and what it means for us?
I think Blackburn's work is a really important reminder that our food choices are about more than just our own health. They affect our whole society and the planet.
Yeah, it's a call to wake up and be more aware, more engaged, and take more control.
Exactly. And even though it seems like a huge problem, we're not powerless. Every choice we make, every bite we take, is a vote for the kind of food system we want to have.
And that's a powerful thought to leave our listeners with.
It is. So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last question to think about. If you could create a food system that truly nourishes us, heals us, and helps the planet, what would it look like?
That's a great question to ponder. Maybe the answer isn't some big, perfect plan, but all the little choices we make each day, the conversations we have, and the actions we take to make things better.
I love that.
Okay, so let's get into those lunatic farming methods, huh? What is Salatin actually doing that's so different from, like, the regular industrial way of farming?
Well, the main thing is he's all about copying nature. you know, like observing how natural ecosystems work.
Right.
And then he tried to design his farm to work the same way.
That makes sense. I mean, industrial agriculture, it's like forcing nature to do what we want, right? Salatin's going with the flow, working with how nature already does things.
Exactly. And a really important part of that is diversity. Remember we were talking about how monoculture is a problem?
Yeah.
Well, Salatin's doing the opposite. Instead of those huge fields of just one crop, he's got all these different plants and animals all mixed together and interacting.
So it's like this little self-contained ecosystem he's got going on there. But how does that work practically?
Okay, so picture this. Instead of his cows being stuck in a feedlot, they get to roam around on these different pastures.
Okay. Yeah.
And these pastures aren't just grass. They've got a whole mix of things, growing grasses, legumes, herbs, even some trees. It's like a salad bar for the cows.
Uh-huh. A cow salad bar. That's awesome. So they're getting all sorts of different nutrients, right?
Exactly. And moving them around like that is really important for the soil.
How so?
Well, think about it. Naturally, you've got herds of animals. They move across the land, right?
Yeah.
They eat for a bit, then move on, so they don't overgraze and kill the plants. Salatin's copying that pattern on his farm. He moves those cows to a new pasture every day so the old one can regrow.
I get it. So it's like giving the land a chance to rest and recover. Totally different from the way things are done on those big industrial farms.
Exactly.
Mm.
And here's the amazing thing, all that cow manure, it actually helps fertilize the soil.
Makes sense.
And because the cows are always moving, the manure gets spread around nice and evenly. No big piles of waste building up. It's like a natural compost system.
So he doesn't need any of those chemical fertilizers.
Nope. He's all about using what nature gives him. And get this, he even has chickens as part of the system. After the cows have been in a pasture, he brings in the chickens.
Chickens? What for?
Well, you know how chickens love to scratch around.
Uh-huh.
Well, they go to town on that cow manure, eating the fly larva, spreading it around even more. It's like natural pest control that also breaks down the manure so it can go back into the soil.
That's incredible. It's like everything has a purpose. Nothing goes to waste.
Right. And it's not even just about being efficient. It's about creating this healthy ecosystem. Salatin says his pastures are just teeming with life, earthworms, beneficial insects, all kinds of little critters that make the soil healthy.
So it's not just about growing food. It's about making the land itself better.
Exactly. And that's how it all comes back to Blackburn's argument about the whole farm-to-pharma thing. Salatin's showing that we can produce food that's good for the environment and good for us.
It's like breaking that cycle of needing chemicals and medicines that Blackburn was talking about. But let's be honest, isn't this kind of farming just a small-scale thing? Can it really work to feed the whole world?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated one. But Salatin says regenerative agriculture can be scaled up. We just have to change our way of thinking.
What do you mean?
Well, we're so focused on getting the absolute most we can out of the land, you know, like squeezing every last drop. We need to stop thinking that way. We need to think about sustainability, about the long term.
I see. So instead of just trying to get the most food out of the soil now, we should focus on making land healthy so it can keep producing food for a long time.
Exactly. And Salatin actually believes that this regenerative way can end up producing more food in the long run. His soil is getting better and better, which means he doesn't have to add as much fertilizer and stuff.
That makes sense. So if his methods are so good, why isn't everybody doing it?
Well, there are some hurdles, for sure. For one thing, it takes a lot more skill and knowledge than conventional farming.
Right.
You can't just rely on chemicals to solve every problem, you know. You really have to understand how the whole ecosystem works.
Right.
It's more complicated.
I bet.
And then there's the whole infrastructure issue, like the way our food system works now. It's built around those giant farms with their processing plants and everything.
Right.
If we wanted to switch to a more local, regenerative model, it would take a lot of changes.
So we'd have to start supporting those smaller farms instead of the big companies.
Yeah, and we need to find new ways to get that food to people, ways that are affordable for everyone.
That sounds like a huge challenge, but really important.
It is. And I think Blackburn would say it's crucial if we want to get away from this whole farm-to-pharma cycle he's talking about.
You know, this reminds me of something else Blackburn brought up. He talked about this idea of a war on meat.
Right, right.
What's his take on that?
He's not really buying into it, you know? Like, he's skeptical of this idea that meat is the enemy. He points out that humans have been eating meat forever.
Yeah.
And he wonders if this big push for plant-based stuff is really about health, or if maybe it's about something else.
What do you mean?
Well, he points out that some of the people who are really pushing for plant-based diets, They have connections to companies that make those alternatives.
Oh,
He's not saying plant-based is bad, but he wants us to think about the motivations behind it all. Like, who's profiting?
that's fair. It's always good to question things, especially when there's so much money involved.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes Salatin's approach so refreshing. He's not demonizing meat. He's not telling people what to eat. He just wants to produce good food in a way that's in tune with nature.
It's a much more balanced perspective, It's not just this food is good, this food is bad.
Right. It's about understanding that we're all different
Yeah,
and we have to make our own choices about what we eat.
that's true. So, okay, where does this leave us? We've learned about these problems with industrial agriculture and the potential of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
But if we're concerned about this whole farm to pharma thing, what can we actually do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But the good news is that both Blackburn and Salatin have some ideas. They offer some practical things we can do to start making changes.
Oh, good. I'm all ears. What do they suggest?
Well, the biggest thing they both emphasize is the power of the consumer. Making informed choices about what we buy.
You mean being conscious consumers?
Exactly. We need to pay more attention to where our food is coming from and who we're supporting when we spend our money.
But isn't that just a drop in the bucket?
Mm-hmm.
Can our individual choices really change anything?
I used to think that too, but Blackburn argues that consumer demand is actually a really powerful force. When enough people start asking for certain things, companies have to listen.
Yeah, that makes sense. But a lot of people aren't even aware of these issues, are they?
That's where education comes in. Blackburn says we need to demand more transparency from the food industry. Like, we should know exactly what's in our food, how it's produced, what the impact is on the environment, the whole story.
So basically, we need to read labels, do our research, ask questions.
Exactly. Don't just believe the marketing hype. Be a critical thinker.
It's actually pretty empowering to think that we do have some control over our food system.
Right. And it goes beyond our individual choices, too. Blackburn also encourages us to get involved in pushing for bigger changes, like policy changes, supporting laws that promote a healthier, more sustainable food system.
So things like supporting legislation that encourages these regenerative farming practices.
Exactly. Or pushing for stricter rules about those harmful food additives we talked about.
Okay. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Making smart choices as consumers, educating ourselves and others, and pushing for change at a higher level.
You got it. And it's not about being perfect or doing everything all at once. Just take small steps in the right direction, and things will start to change.
I love that. It doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels like something we can actually do.
Exactly. And speaking of doing something concrete, there's one specific action that both Blackburn and Salatin emphasize: supporting your local farms.
I've heard that before. Buy local, support your community. But what kind of impact does that really have?
Well, for starters, it means the food doesn't have to travel as far, so that's good for the environment. Plus, you're getting fresher food, which is usually healthier. But it goes even deeper than that.
Really? How so?
When you buy directly from a local farmer, you're not just buying food, you're investing in your community. You're supporting a small business, you're helping to create jobs, you're protecting farmland. It's a win-win-win.
Ah, now I'm seeing why both Blackburn and Salatin are so passionate about local food systems. It's not just about the food itself, it's about building stronger, more sustainable communities.
Exactly. And it can be a really amazing experience going to a farmer's market, actually meeting the people who grow your food, learning about what they do. It's like reconnecting with where your food comes from, and that's pretty powerful.
I can imagine. It's so different from just picking things up at the supermarket.
Right. It brings back that human connection that's often lost in our big industrial food system.
So we've talked about the downsides of industrial agriculture, the potential of regenerative agriculture, the importance of being conscious consumers. But there's one big piece of the puzzle we haven't really touched on yet: cost.
Ah, yes. The elephant in the room. Isn't all this healthy, ethically sourced food a lot more expensive?
That's what a lot of people think, right? Like, eating well is a luxury that most people can't afford.
And sometimes it is more expensive, to be fair. But Salatin makes an interesting point. He says that we tend to focus on the price tag on the food without thinking about what he calls the hidden costs.
Hidden costs? What does he mean?
Well, think about it. When you buy those cheap processed foods, you might save money at the store. But later on, you might end up spending more on healthcare,
Because that kind of diet can lead to all sorts of health problems.
Exactly. And those healthcare costs add up, not just for you, but for everyone.
That's true. And then there's the environmental costs of industrial agriculture, right? The pollution, the damage to the soil, the water usage. Somebody's going to pay for all that too.
Right. So what Salatin's saying is when you take all those hidden costs into account, the difference between industrial food and regenerative food isn't as big as we think.
I see. It's about looking at the bigger picture, the true cost of food, not just the sticker price.
Exactly. And there are actually ways to make healthy food more affordable, even if you're on a tight budget, like buying things in bulk, cooking at home more, maybe even growing some of your own food, even if it's just a few herbs in a pot on your windowsill.
It's about being creative and making healthy eating a priority, no matter what your situation is.
Right. And remember, it's not about being perfect. You don't have to change everything overnight. Every little step counts.
That's really encouraging.
It's like we've gone on this big journey today,
Yeah.
from these huge systemic problems to the small everyday choices we all make.
Yeah, it's true. And that's one of the things that makes Dan Blackburn's work so interesting. He connects those individual choices to those big systems, shows how it's all linked together.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't shy away from asking the tough questions.
Right.
Like, remember those plant-based meat alternatives we talked about?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he questions those too.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype, right? But Blackburn makes us think critically. Like, are these alternatives really better for the environment? Are they actually healthier? Or are they just another kind of processed food dressed up to look good?
It's such a good point. I know I've been guilty of that myself.
Yeah,
Thinking, oh, I'll just swap out my beef burger for a plant-based one. Easy, right?
right.
But Blackburn makes you realize it's not that simple. You got to look beyond the marketing. Think about the ingredients, how it's made, what it does to the environment, all of that.
And that's where it gets tricky. There's not always a clear answer.
Right.
Some of those alternatives might be better for the planet, but not as nutritious. Others might be more nutritious, but use up more resources to make. It's complicated.
So what are people supposed to do? How do
Yeah.
you figure it all out?
It goes back to that idea of being an informed consumer, you know? Do your research, read those labels carefully, ask questions. Don't be afraid to challenge what you think you know.
And maybe just accept that there's no one perfect answer. We got to make the best choices we can, given our own situations and what we believe in.
Exactly. And be willing to change your mind as you learn new things, you know? The science about food and nutrition is always evolving. What we think is healthy today could be different tomorrow.
That's true. It's not about following some strict set of rules. It's about being flexible, adaptable, and always learning.
I like that. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What are your final thoughts for our listeners on this whole farm to pharma concept? What does it all mean for us as individuals?
I think what Blackburn's done is he's reminded us that our food choices aren't just about personal health. They're about the health of our whole society and the planet, too.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call, you know? Be more aware, get more involved, and take more control.
Yeah. Exactly. And it might feel like a huge problem, but we're not helpless. Every choice we make, every bite we take, it's all part of creating the kind of food system we want.
That's a powerful message.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you all with one last question to think about. If you could design a food system that truly nourishes us, heals us, and sustains the planet, what would it look like?
That's a great question to ponder. And maybe the answer isn't some big, perfect plan. Maybe it's about all the little choices we make every day, the conversations we have, the actions we take to make things better, one step at a time.
Beautifully said. That's it for this deep dive, everyone. Thanks for joining us.